Escape, a work of fiction based on a true story. Nearly 23,000 American soldiers were captured during the Battle of the Bulge. I was one of them. A corporal originally from western Pennsylvania serving in the 422nd Infantry Regiment of the 106th Infantry Division. I always thought of myself as a tough guy, one who was willing to fight anyone, anytime. I now believe it was that toughness that made my escape from the Stalag IV-B P.O.W. prison possible. I was not smarter than the Germans, but I was a kid who was not afraid to get his nose bloodied in a fight. They had the guns, they had barbed wire fences, massive searchlights, and the vicious dogs. What I had was my toughness. I escaped, and I brought 2 of my buddies with me. Brought them all the way back to join the American forces, back to the special luxuries provided at Camp Lucky Strike. When I told the lieutenant who checked me into Camp Lucky Strike that I wanted to immediately get back into the fight, he laughed caustically. "Son, you're so thin that you'd fall over if somebody broke wind in front of you." He was right. I had lost nearly 60 pounds while I was a special guest of the Nazi regime. Still, I had escaped, and now, many years later, I have a story to tell. Before sharing my escape story, I need to tell you about how we were captured. When I say we, I mean the 6,697 G.I.s from the 106th Infantry Division, who were captured during the week before Christmas, in what historians now call the Ardennes-Alsace campaign. We did not call it that. We were in Belgium, along the German border, in a broad valley called the Eifel. Most of us just called it the phony profanity Eifel, meaning not the real Eiffel Tower in Paris. Just a bunch of farms, not much nightlife. 2 regiments, mine, the 422nd and the 423rd, were in the valley. There were some low mountains surrounding the valley. That was where the 424th Regiment was sent, up to Winterspelt. As I retell these events, 61 years after they occurred, I know considerably more about them than I did as a 20-year-old smoking Chesterfields while on guard duty behind a barricade of logs. I now know that the Germans realized we were green newbies, not the seasoned veterans that we just replaced. They also knew that the Americans had become overconfident, expecting the German military to just disappear as we approached, and they had a bold, decisive plan to end the war with a German victory. They would concentrate their tanks at a single point in the Allied line, breaking it completely. That point, of course, was the Eifel. When I say green newbies, I mean really green. We had arrived in England just 9 days before we were shipped to Europe. I was considered one of the old-timers since I had enlisted during the summer of 1942, as soon as I had turned 18. So, by December 1944, I had earned my corporal's stripes and was viewed as the leader of my unit. But this was my first experience in a real battle. I had lots of infantry training back in the States, but no real on-the-battlefield experience. The division that I originally joined was split. And then my new one was split. Each time they would bring in more new G.I.s for training, and I would do the training again. I joined the 106th Division in Fort Jackson in South Carolina during the summer of 1943. We trained there, then at Camp Atterbury in Indiana, and finally at Fort Miles Standish in Massachusetts. That was where we were deployed from in October 1944. Nearly every G.I. in our regiment was a draftee. None were career military. Even our officers came from civilian jobs. The 106th Division was as green as they come, a weak spot that the Germans could exploit. The full force of the German spear was pointed toward the Eifel, but we did not know it. I now believe, these many years later, that the 106th Division could have survived longer than it did if two other factors had not come into play. The first was that our commanding general, Major General Allen Jones, had spread his forces too thin to cover the terrain. I have read the official U.S. Army Service Manual. It clearly says that an Army division should be assigned to cover no more than 5 miles of a battlefront. At that distance, communication is optimal, and opportunities to quickly move units to reinforce points of attack are readily obtainable. However, General Jones had spread us out over 22 miles of terrain. Also remember that he had separated the 424th Regiment and sent them up to Winterspelt, so they were 35 miles from where those of us in the valley were positioned. I can tell you that it was about a half-mile to the unit on our right and nearly a mile to the unit on our left. The armored cavalry units were even further away. Such spacing did not concern the general's staff when they ordered it. After all, we were supposedly in a pacified region, and the war was expected to be over soon. Both assumptions proved to be wrong. The second factor was that just as the Germans began their attack on the positions we occupied, General Jones had a fatal heart attack. His staff's attention was drawn away from the battle to concern for his health. I imagine that there was pure confusion among the headquarters staffers. Additionally, General Jones's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Horace Catheay, was in Winterspelt with the 424th Regiment. As the battle began, the Germans jammed our communications. General Catheay had to depend on couriers, a slow process in modern warfare. Thus, at the most crucial point in the battle, the 106th Division was essentially leaderless. I did not know any of this as my unit stood guard behind our log barricade. All I knew was that the howitzer battery a mile away on my right began intensively firing again and again and again. I have always admired the actions of 101st Airborne Division during the siege of Bastogne. The so-called battled bastards of Bastogne have always been true heroes for me. They held out for nearly 3 weeks against the vanguard of the German army. I wish I could say that the capture of the 106th Division was a battle of equal heroism. It was not. In truth, my own unit never fired a shot at the Germans. Their breakthrough was about 3 miles to my left, but we were never ordered to reposition to support the troops who were there. We stayed where we had been told to stay. I did not know that we had surrendered until an American officer in a jeep drove up to tell us that we had done so. From reading history, I now know that the 422nd and the 423rd were encircled in a decisive tank maneuver. The 2 German columns came around us and then joined in our rear. One source that I recently read said that one of our units attempted a counterattack, but it failed in less than an hour. They did not say which one, and I never heard any discussion of a counterattack by the other G.I.s. I do not know whether it happened or not. Even if it did, it was too little, too late. The German attack began on the 16th. On the 19th, we were loaded onto German trucks, heading back to the fatherland and the fine facilities at Stalag IV-B. I have often been asked what I remember most about the POW prison. My answer surprises many. I remember the female skylarks building their nests on the open ground, just outside the prison's fence, not in the trees or in the bushes or under the hedges. No, in the open where all kinds of predators can steal their eggs. To me, they seemed defiant. I know this is dangerous. I know this can have terrible consequences. Nonetheless, I will do it. Here, just beyond the fences and beyond the machine guns, and just out of reach of the watchtowers, beyond inhumanity and barbarism. Yet, I still will do it. You cannot take away my courage. A defiant skylark mother, one I could completely admire. I grew up on my family's dairy farm, just 20 miles southeast of Erie, Pennsylvania. I knew about cold winters, bitter winds, and hard work in freezing temperatures. Every morning, my brothers and I would get up well before dawn and bring our cows in for milking, feeding, and care. I remember having to break through the ice to open the doors of our milking barns. I remember how cold our rubber boots were after sitting out on the porch all night. I knew what it was like to have every breath freeze in midair, even as you spoke. I was tough, and I had grown up fighting the winter cold. Nonetheless, the winter I spent at Stalag IV-B felt especially vicious. They had taken my army coat and my gloves when they processed me at the POW camp. They also peered into my underwear and poked an instrument up my rectum to check for contraband. Then they photographed me and assigned me to an NCO barracks. There was no heat, no electricity, no water. No one had a blanket. The latrine was a trench in the back room. 125 men crammed together, each sleeping on a straw mat complete with bugs that bite. The barracks had windows, but none had glass, and each was covered with a black canvas to enforce the blackout rules. However, it was not the physical conditions that made the winter feel vicious. No, it was the atmosphere of the place, particularly how the guards treated us. They never missed an opportunity to degrade, to demean. Snow and ice and winds bring cold. What the guards did to us brought despair. So it was that, in late March, when I saw the first skylark building her heroic nest, that my own spirits rose. I could be as courageous as that little bird. Yes, this will be dangerous. I know it could have terrible consequences. Nonetheless, I will do it. I will escape. It was in late March 1945 that I noticed a change in the guards manning the machine guns in the watchtowers. I noticed they were younger, less certain, and I noticed that they were working longer shifts, early morning until late at night. I also noted that there were now almost no guards walking down in the yard amongst the prisoners. In January, there were always 12 to 15 guards in the yard whenever POW prisoners were out of their barracks, and there was always a couple of SS officers supervising the guards. Now, almost no one. We still had a goon ranting at us over the loudspeakers 3 times a day, but things were now different. I knew things had really changed when one of the British NCOs told me that a supply of 1,000 Red Cross packages had arrived in the storehouse, and they were all being distributed to prisoners. Understand that, even though the Red Cross sent POW camps many thousands of packages, those of us in Stalag IV-B seldom received any. I remember in February that our officers distributed 150 packages, by far the most ever. However, even then, the valuable items, like chocolate, canned milk, and cigarettes, had been removed, stolen before they were distributed to us. The German guards stole both the full Red Cross packages and their most valuable contents. Suddenly, folks were being honest and doing their duty under the Geneva Conventions. Big change. Stalag IV-B had its own clandestine, jerry-rigged prison radio. Where it was or who operated it, I never knew. Still, the information it provided was passed from barracks to barracks. We knew the military situation on almost all fronts. We knew where the Russians were, where the Allies were, what cities were being bombed. By the end of March, all of us in the camp knew that Germany's days were numbered. The end was coming soon. Spring came early to Central Europe in 1945. I remember that one glorious afternoon. Several of us from our barracks basked in a sunny spot close to the barbed wire fence. For a few moments we forgot the snow, ice, and bitter winds of the awful winter. We were oblivious to the guards in the watch towers with their ever-present machine guns. However, they were not oblivious to us. After all too short of a time, they ordered us away from the fence. They knew that guards would be shot if they allowed a prisoner to escape. Still, it was springtime, and we knew from the clandestine radio that the end would be soon. Magnificent springtime. Yet nothing else had changed. The food was still terrible. We were malnourished, looked like skeletons, and were weak from being out of shape. And we were still prisoners. But springtime magically revived a muted hope. One of my grandchildren recently asked me why I volunteered to work on a German work gang. Conditions were terrible in the POW camp, but they were far worse on the work gangs. 20-hour days doing back-breaking, dangerous work. No breaks, no food, brutal cold. And the guards would shoot prisoners at will. It was slavery at its very worst. I did it because it provided the best opportunity for escape. I had worked on 2 previous work gangs, so I knew what to expect. The conditions were atrocious, but I knew that other prisoners had escaped from the gangs. Of course, the German guards would never admit that a prisoner had escaped. That would bring the firing squad. They would simply tell their superiors that the prisoner had been killed by a piece of heavy equipment. It happened so often, no one ever questioned the story. I knew escape was possible. Particularly with the batch of new guards that I was seeing in the watchtowers, teenagers and old men. My thought was that I could probably wrestle an Uzi from one of them. As I said before, I am really mean in a fight. Several of the British NCOs in my barracks spoke passable German. They said they heard that Berlin had ordered our camp to send out a large work party to make repairs from the Allied bombing. Although it was a violation of the Geneva Convention agreements about POWs, Germany had, nonetheless, often used prisoners to man their work gangs. The legality of the work gangs did not bother me, no. My interests were solely in using it to make my escape. When in early April I learned that there were plans for a large work gang, I volunteered to join it. I urged my 2 buddies, Bruce Warren and Harold Curtis, to also volunteer. When the list came out, Sergeant Curtis and I were on it, but not Corporal Warren. I wanted all of us to go. This would probably be our last chance for escape. I didn't know what the Germans would do with the POWs. I knew that in Russia, Germans had exterminated many prisoners, machine gunning them in mass graves. So I had a major problem, how to get Bruce Warren on the list. Fortunately, Bruce had an ace up his sleeve. He had been assigned a job helping in the camp kitchen. Doesn't sound like much when the fare is mainly sugar beets, rutabagas, turnips, mushy potatoes, and dry pea pods. Of course, such delicacies were served any way you liked them, as long as it was boiled. On very rare occasions, there was a little meat of questionable origin. But when hunger is the #1 priority, it had a bargaining value that proved to be Bruce's passport out. One of our machine gun platoon buddies, Private Lackey from Oklahoma, jumped at the chance to trade IDs with Bruce. If you were to see Corporal Warren and Private Lackey standing side by side, you would be amazed that anyone would chance severe discipline by trying such a switch. However, it worked without a hitch. Obviously, the Germans knew the war situation as well as we did, probably better. Our POW camp was on the side of the Elbe River, in territory assigned to the Russians. Consequently, they were far more concerned with getting their full work party quota, Geneva Convention be damned, than whether a prisoner's name started with an A or a Z, or whether the picture on the name tag matched the face. The pictures on the ID tags were very poor representations, and our faces had been distorted by the loss of so much weight. So, you can understand the guards' lethargy. Whatever the reason, it worked well for us. All of us would have the same opportunity. All of us would make the break when the situation was right. We got ready for the work gang, which didn't take much. We gave away everything we wouldn't need or want, or that was too heavy to carry. We left behind our makeshift dishes and cups, took an extra shower, and hid our travel food. It was for each of us just 1/4 of a Red Cross parcel. But it was, nonetheless, precious to us. The Red Cross parcels were our lifeline in the prison camp. They came irregularly, but when they did, they brought us cheese, butter, meat, fruit, sugar, jam, milk, and more. And cigarettes. Cigarettes were the currency of the camp. You could trade them for anything from food to valuables. Every exchange was based on the number of cigarettes. My Jewish friend, Aaron, who bunked a couple of straw mats from me, had a theory that the cigarettes were like a miniature version of the real money system. He spoke like an economic theorist. He astutely observed that the number of cigarettes at any given time, regulated as they were by the parcel distribution and the perishables they provided, accurately modeled, in microcosm, our entire monetary system. Wow, he was smart and charming, and I often wondered what he would do after the war. However, I never saw him again after we left Stalag IV-B. Some prisoners hoarded their cigarettes, hoping to use them as bargaining chips for their escape or their survival. Others smoked them all in a frenzy, trying to forget their misery and fear. And some traded them for things that were more precious to them than anything else. Letters from home, photographs of loved ones, books, or music or art. Those were the things that kept us sane and hopeful in the face of despair and horror. I was one of those who traded my cigarettes for books. I loved reading, and I found solace and inspiration in the words of great writers. I read novels, poems, essays, histories, biographies, anything I could get my hands on. I learned about different cultures, different perspectives, different ways of living and thinking. I felt a connection with the authors, as if they were speaking to me across time and space. I also shared my books with others who appreciated them, and we had lively discussions and debates about them. Reading and talking about books gave me a sense of purpose and joy that nothing else could. One book that changed my life was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. It was a thrilling story of revenge and redemption, of love and betrayal, of justice and injustice. It was also a story of escape, of how a man who was wrongly imprisoned for 14 years managed to break free from his dungeon and reclaim his identity and fortune. I was captivated by the adventures and schemes of Edmond Dantes, the protagonist, and how he outwitted his enemies and helped his friends. I admired his courage, his intelligence, his perseverance, and his generosity. I also sympathized with his pain, his anger, his loneliness, and his doubt. He was a complex and fascinating character who taught me many lessons about life. One lesson that stuck with me was how he used his knowledge and skills to escape from his prison. He learned many things from an old fellow prisoner named Abbe Faria, who was a scholar and a philosopher. He learned languages, mathematics, science, history, geography, and more. He also learned how to make tools from simple materials, how to dig tunnels through stone walls, how to disguise himself as a corpse, and how to swim in the sea. He used all these things to plan and execute his escape, which was nothing short of miraculous. I wondered if I could do something similar. I wondered if I could use my own knowledge and skills to escape from my prison camp. I wondered if I could find a way out of this hell. I decided to try. There were no officers in the work gang, only us grunts. The Germans treated them differently, as if they were gentlemen. They treated us like dirt, grunts, as we said. It was a large work gang of about 500 prisoners. I remember seeing Italians, Russians, French, Belgians, Dutch, South African, Australian, and British troops. There were also about 75 other American G.I.s in it. However, the largest contingent was from what was called the Polish Home Guard. The Germans really hated the Polish Home Guard prisoners. It was evident in everything they did to them. The Home Guard had led the bloody Warsaw Revolt against German occupation, which lasted for nearly 2 months. German troops had to be pulled from the Russian front to quell the uprising. The German guards would regularly beat the prisoners, deny them food, and march them for hours in the winter's snowstorms. Their participation in the various work gangs was never by their own choice. It was always as the severest of punishments. Among the other grunts, the British POWs had the highest status. We were next. Then, the various Europeans. The British POWs had the best deal. Some of them could speak German and would chat with the guards. I hated the guards and wanted nothing to do with them. I just wanted to escape. We marched out of the camp to the train station 2 miles away. The British troops led the way. The 3 of us, Bruce, Harold, and me, followed them closely and boarded a car with 25 of them. I hoped they could tell me what the German guards were saying. Altogether, there were about 70 POWs in my car, including 10 other Americans. We were packed like sardines, but we had to make do. Our train trip took most of an entire day. We had boarded just before dawn and were disembarked in the late afternoon, about 20 minutes before dusk. I cannot tell you which direction the trip went. I remember being shunted onto many sidings while other trains whizzed past us. I think that for a while we backtracked over a line that we had traveled on earlier. But I can't say for sure. I can say, for the most part, our train moved slowly. Only on one stretch did the engine speed up, and that was to climb a very steep grade. Harold, Bruce, and I grabbed a spot on the back wall. Others found room wherever possible so that the differing nationalities were well mixed, except that along the sliding door were arrayed our British cousins. Now the rail car was metal, but the sliding door was wooden with open slats. Since the weather was now balmy, being by the door brought the fresh spring air as it flowed in. Nice, very nice. However, the sliding door was also proximal to the one and only relief port, a hole cut into the bottom of the car for the purpose. Whenever the biological need occurred, men would do their stuff into the hole. One of the American G.I.s made the serious error of overindulging on the dehydrated foods from his Red Cross parcel. In his case, it was powdered milk. He had emptied an entire container of it. Now mothers constantly urge their children to drink their milk. It is one of nature's best foods, but too much of it can pose dangers. I learned after the war that one of the men from my platoon had died as the result of consuming an entire can of milk powder prior to his final liberation, when the Russians opened all the prison warehouses and their contents were distributed freely to the POWs. So, the American GI in our train car who had emptied an entire container of milk powder was not unique in his lack of restraint. However, no one expected the ferocity of his intestinal explosion. For the Brits, who were enjoying the fresh spring air next to the sliding door, his intestinal explosion proved devastating. They were all dressed in their immaculately tailored and well-cared-for British field uniforms. They did not appreciate his blanket of vomit. It led to volatile verbal exchange. "Bloody Yank" was the only printable remark that I can share. Bruce, Harold, and I laughed our heads off. The episode supplied a brief, but nonetheless enjoyable release of pressure. Just before dusk, the train pulled into a train yard, and we were ordered to disembark and to form up into a tight double-file rank. We began our march, following a convoy of 6 large trucks. Behind us were another 3 trucks which carried the relief German guards who were scheduled to take over from our prison guards at dawn. We walked along a gravel road for a couple of miles. Even though it was now completely dark, I could see from the truck lights that we were now in a forested area, a heavily forested area with no lights. Then, the 9 trucks formed a circle, and we were told to bivouac for the night inside the circle. We were given no water and no food. We slept on the ground without a blanket. Harold, Bruce, and I surveyed our rations and selected some dried meat to eat. Then we curled up together and attempted to sleep. The Germans did not light any fires and ate their own dinners cold. Even though I can't speak German, I was aware of their perpetual concern about being identified by Allied aircraft. I knew they were far less concerned about us than they were about aircraft from above. Nervously, we all made it through the night. In the morning, I could see the area that had been pre-selected for our night's bivouac. Before the war, back when electric trains would take families out from the cities for picnics in the country, this area had been a park for those outings. The electric trains would end their run to here, allowing families a day to explore and enjoy nature. A park with large spreading trees and broad expanses of grass. A witness to a pre-war era of picnics, family get-togethers, and now long gone. Children's laughter. I cannot tell you how exhilarating it was to be in that former park that morning. The grass was damp and the sky bold in its many colors. A wonderful day to be alive. However, 2 events quickly dampened our exhilaration. First, one of the senior guards who spoke English stood up on something and shouted that he had important news. Then he said that President Franklin Roosevelt was now dead. I don't think he said it gleefully. I think it was rather matter-of-fact. Still, I knew that for many Germans such news would be an occasion for joy. Second, we learned that during the night one of the American GIs had attempted suicide by slashing an artery with a razor blade. To the best of my knowledge, he was unsuccessful thanks to quick-acting buddies. Difficult to fathom the emotional trigger for his action, which was so counter to the general mood of the rest of us. Still, the place, the forested park and its massive trees brought calm and reassurance, and the day may yet bring an opportunity to escape. This work of fiction is dedicated to Vernon J. Cumberland, Bruce Waldo, and Horace Catheay, who lived in real life the historical events used to create this work.